It was 6:30 a.m. on December 29th, 1990. I was sitting in the cockpit of a Beech Duchess on the runway at St. John's, Newfoundland, about to cross the North Atlantic for the first time, and wondering just how in the hell I got myself into that situation. Flashback 3 years earlier, and not only had I never even heard of such a thing as being a ferry pilot, I didn't even have a pilot's license. But all that changed when I met Pete Demas Jr. We were both Huey crew chiefs in the Minnesota National Guard, and he told me that his father, Pete Demas Sr., owned an international aircraft delivery company called Orient Air. And he proceeded to tell me about all the pilots in his company flying small planes across the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean and all over the world, and all the great adventures that he had. And from the second he started talking about it, I was hooked. I was mesmerized, and I realized right there and then that that's what I wanted to do for a living, and I vowed to become a ferry pilot. I went to flight school, got all my ratings, started skydiving, and started flying skydivers to get enough hours to qualify for the job. Now, normally, Pete wouldn't have even looked twice at somebody as young and inexperienced as I was. But he'd just had a pilot get killed on a ferry flight and was shorthanded, so he decided to give me a shot. Now I expected them to start me off slow to get some experience, like delivering a 172 to Texas, or at least riding along with an experienced ferry pilot on my first trip. But no. I was told the first week of working for Orient Air that I was to deliver a Beech Duchess, a type of plane that I'd never flown before, to its new owner in Lisbon, Portugal, by myself. Great. Well, I wasn't exactly going to be by myself. Pete was going to be along in the trip delivering a Cessna 206 to its new owner in Zurich, Switzerland. So we'd be together all the way to Portugal, which made me feel a little bit better. And he wasn't exactly going to send me off across the North Atlantic without any training at all. No, he put me through Orient Air's ferry pilot training program, which basically consisted of me sitting in his office for 2 hours drinking scotch with him while he told me all the different ways you could get killed flying small planes over the North Atlantic. It was very inspiring. Now, the route we'd be taking would be from St. Paul, Minnesota to Bangor, Maine, where we'd clear customs. From there, we'd fly to St. John's, Newfoundland, the easternmost point of Canada, and then 1,800 miles across the Atlantic Ocean to Santa Maria in the Azores, which are a cluster of islands 800 miles off the coast of Portugal. And from there, we'd go direct to Lisbon, Portugal. So there I was, sitting on the runway in St. John's, Newfoundland, about to make my first crossing with a million questions running through my head. Like, could I even find Santa Maria? Remember, this was 1990, before GPS. So we based all our navigation on a winds and law forecast from Nav Canada and a paper map. And if my calculations were off even a little bit, or the winds and law forecast was inaccurate, I could miss that island by a long ways and run out of fuel and crash into the ocean. And even if my calculations were correct, did I have enough fuel to make it to Santa Maria? Because normally the Duchess doesn't have the range to make it even half that far. But Pete had installed 2 90-gallon ferry tanks in the cabin, which should give enough range to make it. Should. And would the Duchess even fly with that much fuel on board? Because loaded up like that, the Duchess was going to be 25% over max gross weight and have 2 inches of aft CG. So just getting it off the ground was going to be a challenge. And just to make things interesting, the weather forecast for all of the Azores looked challenging. They were calling for low visibility, low clouds, heavy rain, and high winds. And remember, you have to make it in there because there's no alternate airport within 800 miles. So either find Santa Maria or ditch in the ocean. But Pete had provided me with a survival suit and life raft, so at least I stood a remote chance of survival if I had to ditch. But I decided not to worry about that and concentrate on how much fun it was going to be. So when it was my turn to go, I gave it full throttle, and that poor Beech Duchess staggered into the early morning sky. And as I climbed to altitude, the sun peeked over the horizon, revealing this incredible view of nothing. As far as you could see, all there was open ocean, which was pretty intimidating. But I didn't care. There wasn't a cloud in the sky, and the view was amazing. It didn't take me long to get settled in either. I climbed to altitude, turned on the autopilot, and then sat back with a big bag of snacks, my Walkman, and the latest Tom Clancy book. And as the miles went by, I realized that I'd made the greatest decision of my life. because ferry flying was the easiest job in the world, and I couldn't have been happier. A feeling that lasted to about the halfway point of the trip. But it wasn't my emergency, it was Pete's. About 5 hours into the flight, Pete called on the radio and told me that his vacuum pump had gone out. Now this was a major problem, because the vacuum pump runs the two main instruments a pilot uses to control the plane in clouds: the directional gyro and the artificial horizon. Without these two instruments, Pete would be forced to fly the rest of the night using the emergency needle ball airspeed method. A difficult thing to do even under the best of circumstances, let alone flying in low clouds and rain while trying to find a small island in the middle of the ocean at night. So it was understandable that Pete was more than just a little concerned about the situation. But he had a plan. He would fly to the island of Flores, the first island in the Azores chain. There he would circle in place and wait for me to catch up. Once he saw me, he'd form up by my wing and use me as the artificial horizon, while I led the both of us through the night and the storms to Santa Maria. So it was going to be night IFR formation flying on my first crossing. Nice. So that's what we did. And let me tell you, that night was something else. Because night IFR formation flying is something that civilian pilots just do not train for. And I got a stiff neck looking over my left shoulder, watching the position lights on Pete's plane bob and weave and go back and forth as Pete tried desperately not to lose me in the clouds, while I tried to find the island of Santa Maria using nothing more than a weak NDB beacon. After what seemed like an eternity, the needle on my ADF receiver came alive. I'd found Santa Maria. Now we just had to get down. Pete called Santa Maria Tower and asked for a formation approach, but he was denied. So he came up with the second big plan of the night. He was going to hold in place about 10 miles west of the island of Santa Maria while I went down and shot the approach. Once I got down, I would call him and tell him what the base of the clouds were. Then he was going to descend out over the ocean west of Santa Maria to get below the base of the clouds, and from there he'd use the lights of the island to scud run back to the airport and land on the runway. It was a great plan. At least I was going to be using the actual instrument landing system for my approach and not scud running over open ocean at night in a storm. And it worked like a charm. Well, my part of it anyway. I shot the approach and broke out about 600 feet, and I called Pete and told him what the bases were. Then I landed, taxied to the ramp and shut down, feeling really glad that I was back on dry ground. Then I climbed out and waited for Pete to arrive. And after what seemed like an eternity, I finally saw his lights over the end of the runway as I watched him come in and land. And after landing and shutting down, Pete climbed out of his cockpit looking visibly shaken. He told me that he'd gone through the base of the clouds a lot lower than he thought and had just about hit the ocean before pulling up. And as I was sitting there just trying to process what had happened that day, Pete shrugged it off like the veteran ferry pilot that he was, grabbed his flight bag, and suggested we just go get a drink. And that was the first leg of my 34-year international ferry flying career. And if I'd have known every single trip from that point on would have a story like that in it, I don't know if I'd have kept going. Who am I kidding? Of course I would have. Now, if you like that story and want to hear more, stay tuned. I got a lot more coming. If you want to read more about these stories, check out my books, Ferry Pilot and Dangerous Flights. Signed copies are available on my website, carrymccauley.com, or you can pick them both up on Amazon. Well, thanks for watching, and as always, keep your speed up.